Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
We're heading into some truly uncharted and frankly pretty unsettling territory today.
Yeah, we really are. Sitting on the table between us is this fascinating stack of source material centered mostly around a book called Contact, a tactical manual for post-collapse survival. It's by an author named Max Velocity.
And, if you were just to glance at the cover of this book, you might completely dismiss it immediately.
Oh, absolutely. You'd look at it and think, okay, this is nothing more than a doomsday prepper's how-to guide. Like a niche instruction manual for stockpiling canned beans and burying shipping containers out in the desert.
Right, but we're taking a completely different approach for this deep dive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are not reading this to figure out how to build a bunker. Instead, we are using this manual as a lens. We're treating it as a systems-level case study.
Which is such a better way to look at it. I mean, the mission of this deep dive is to explore what actually happens to human behavior, to our social structures, and to our everyday reality when the overarching systems we rely on completely evaporate.
We really want to understand how societies depend on systems of law, order, and mutual trust. And while we want to examine the terrifying mechanics of what happens when individuals must suddenly rely entirely on their own capacity for defense and survival.
That is the crucial starting point right there. Because to truly understand the gravity of a systemic collapse, we first have to rigorously define the baseline of the world you and I live in right now.
Right, the invisible architecture.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Modern societies do not just happen organically. They rely entirely on highly complex centralized systems. And the absolute most critical of these, the bedrock upon which everything else is built, is the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force.
Think about what that actually means for a moment. We have police departments, we have conference judicial courts, we have an intricate legal framework that spans from local ordinances all the way to federal laws.
And because those institutions exist, and because we collectively believe in their power, you do not have to stand guard at your front door with a rifle every night.
You just lock the deadbolt and go to sleep.
Yeah, this centralized security system allows for the division of labor. You can specialize. You can spend your life becoming an accountant, or a teacher, a software engineer, or a podcast host.
Hey, I resemble that remark, but seriously, you are fundamentally outsourcing your physical security to the state. In exchange for paying taxes and obeying the law, you get to participate in a highly complex, interconnected economic and social system without constantly worrying about physical predation.
Let's dig into that structural dependence, because the author's starting premise challenges that exact comfort zone.
Yeah.
He points out that we live in what he calls a fast food society.
Which is so true. We're driven by immediate gratification,
Yeah.
and we are completely, utterly dependent on technology and conveniences that, let's be honest, we barely understand.
We really don't. And the best example of this systemic fragility is the just-in-time supply chain.
Yes. I think most people assume that the grocery store down the street has this massive warehouse in the back filled with weeks of extra food.
But it doesn't. Not at all. The modern supply chain is an algorithmic marvel, but it's designed for extreme economic efficiency, not resilience.
It's all about cutting overhead.
Right. Supermarkets have virtually eliminated backroom stock to reduce inventory carrying costs. When you scan a barcode at the register, that data is instantly transmitted to a regional distribution center,
Which then algorithmically routes a diesel truck to replenish that exact item within maybe 24 to 48 hours.
that's a highly calibrated continuous flow of goods. But, and this is the big but, that flow requires electricity to run the servers. It requires internet connectivity to transmit the data. It needs stable financial systems to process the transactions and diesel fuel to power the logistics network.
Which means the system is incredibly brittle. If the power grid fails, the relay stations for your cellular network might run on backup diesel generators for, what, maybe 3 days?
3 days is pushing it in some areas, yeah.
And once that diesel is gone, the communication network drops. The moment the data stops flowing, the supply trucks stop moving.
Within 3 days, the grocery store shelves are completely bare.
And suddenly, that invisible safety net of law and order, the one that relies entirely on people being fed and comfortable, is just gone.
Well, that biological reality sets in. When people are actually hungry and the state cannot project force to maintain order, it forces an instantaneous redesign of the entire social system.
Everything flips.
Everything. Without centralized enforcement, security becomes completely decentralized. The rule of law disappears. Individuals are suddenly forced into a paradigm where they have to rely entirely on their own physical capacity for defense.
It's a complete inversion of how modern civilized humans are conditioned to operate from birth. You're no longer an accountant or a teacher first.
You're a survivor first.
And this transitions perfectly into the first major barrier the text identifies. Because the author, Max Velocity, isn't just a theorist sitting in an armchair. He is a former British special operations soldier.
Right. He served in the parachute regiment and later worked extensively as a security contractor in incredibly hostile environments like Iraq and Afghanistan.
So with all that firsthand combat experience, you might expect his survival manual to start by telling you, which rifle to buy or how to build a perimeter wall.
But he doesn't do that at all.
No, he argues that the highest barrier to survival in a post-collapse world isn't a lack of weaponry, and it isn't even a lack of food. It's entirely psychological.
He introduces this concept called the dislocation of expectations.
The dislocation of expectations. It's a phenomenal psychological concept to unpack here. It essentially describes a catastrophic failure of normalcy bias.
Our everyday environments constantly condition us against survival in a collapse scenario. You are deeply conditioned through decades of lived experience to expect institutional protection.
If your house catches fire, you call the fire department.
If someone breaks a window, you dial emergency services.
When a massive systemic crisis hits, the normal human reaction is to freeze. We expect that the authorities will eventually arrive to restore order.
But in a true collapse, public workers abandon their posts to protect their own families. The cavalry is not coming.
And when people realize this, they experience a severe psychological dislocation. Their mental model of the world no longer matches the physical reality of the world.
They literally cannot process it. So they often remain in a state of paralyzing denial, waiting for a system that no longer exists to save them.
I want to pause on that because I think it's easy to judge people in that state of denial from the comfort of our current reality. But the author points out how pre-event laws actually create a systemic hesitation in us, which is entirely by design.
Yes, the system trains us to hesitate. In a stable, functioning society, using physical force has severe, life-altering legal consequences.
If you misjudge a situation and use violence, you go to prison. It's that simple.
We are deeply programmed, socially and legally, to avoid violence at almost all costs because the system punishes it ruthlessly.
But post-collapse, that ingrained civilized hesitation can be fatal. Imagine you are suddenly in a self-defense situation where you have to act proportionately and immediately to stop a legal threat, but your brain is still frantically consulting the rule book of a society that vanished a week ago.
That hesitation is the psychological friction between two incompatible systems. In a civilized system, hesitation is a feature. It prevents unnecessary violence and allows the justice system to mediate disputes.
But in a collapsed decentralized system, that exact same hesitation is a catastrophic bug.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the physiological realities of conflict, it explains the profound freeze response the author details. In sudden combat situations, especially for civilians entirely unaccustomed to violence, the body undergoes a massive physiological dump.
The adrenal glands just flood the system.
Your heart rate skyrockets well above 150 beats per minute, and when that happens, you lose your fine motor skills.
Your peripheral vision collapses into tunnel vision.
Your auditory processing can distort, leading to auditory exclusion where you don't even hear people screaming right next to you.
The text mentions that historically, looking at combat data from major conflicts, there are recorded statistics of soldiers in combat simply not firing their weapons at all.
Or they would just aim above the enemy's heads and fire blindly.
And these were trained soldiers. It speaks to a deep, innate human resistance to taking another human life.
The psychological barrier to lethal force is massive. The manual emphasizes that the only way to override that civilized freeze response is by building muscle memory through incredibly rigorous, realistic, and repetitive training.
You cannot rely on cognitive decision-making when your brain is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol.
You have to train the physical movement so thoroughly that when the cognitive overload hits, your body automatically knows to seek cover, move, communicate with your group, and return fire without requiring conscious deliberation.
The way he describes the sensory overload of violence is jarring, and it really dispels a lot of myths. He spends time talking about the reality of small arms fire.
Oh, the Hollywood myth.
Right. We have all been conditioned by decades of movies to think that bullets sound a certain way. Kind of clean, cinematic, maybe a sharp pew, or the muted whisper of a silencer.
But the author shatters that illusion. He describes the terrifying physical reality of high-velocity rifle rounds breaking the sound barrier right next to you.
It is not a clean sound at all. It's a violent, deafening crack and thump. He says it resembles a massive bullwhip being cracked inches from your eardrum.
And he describes how rounds don't just hit things neatly. They tear up asphalt, they rip massive branches out of trees, and they kick up blinding clouds of dirt and debris.
The sheer chaotic violence of a firefight is physically paralyzing if you haven't been, as he calls it, battle inoculated.
And that leads directly into the psychological coping mechanisms required to survive that level of chaos. Because the human mind is not designed to process the collapse of civilization and the threat of imminent violent death simultaneously without fracturing.
Right, so the author advocates for a specific psychological tool to manage this trauma, which is quite revealing about the architecture of human resilience.
Yes, the concept of compartmentalization.
He argues that to function, you essentially have to build a mental fort. Think about the sheer scale of the horror. Your entire country has collapsed, the rule of law is gone, the supply chains are dead, and you don't know if your extended family 2 states over is even alive.
That overarching reality is too massive. It's too terrifying to process all at once.
If you focus on the big picture, you will spiral into despair and paralysis. So the manual says you cannot try to eat the whole post-event elephant at once. You have to deliberately shrink your world.
You compartmentalize the overarching horror and focus entirely on the immediate, tangible threat. He uses the analogy of a crocodile right near your boat.
I love that analogy. You don't worry about the hurricane forming over the ocean. You deal with the crocodile snapping at the oars.
It's an intentional restriction of your cognitive horizon. He's effectively saying that a survivor has to learn to operate with 2 distinct minds.
One part of your mind acknowledges the strategic, grim reality in the background, but your active conscious mind deliberately enters a state of hyper-focused denial about the macro-level collapse.
Instead, it pours all of its energy into the exact physical task directly in front of you. Clearing the hallway, applying a tourniquet to a wound, figuring out how to bypass the ignition on a stalled vehicle.
You create little micro-rituals, obsessing over having your medical gear perfectly organized or maintaining your equipment meticulously to build an artificial sense of control and mental confidence.
It is a profound psychological survival mechanism designed to prevent existential dread from incapacitating your ability to act in the present moment.
But wait, I have to ask, how does that actually scale? We're talking about individual psychological survival, but humans don't survive in isolation.
Rarely, if ever.
If an entire neighborhood or a family unit is going through this severe psychological dislocation, how do they bridge the gap from a collection of terrified individuals to a functional group? How do you actually organize when everyone is mentally retreating into their own compartmentalized reality?
That is the exact pivot point where individual psychology must translate into sociology. And it brings us to the reorganization of society at its most granular level. The emergence of the decentralized micro-institution.
The micro-institution.
When centralized enforcement vanishes, the family unit, or a small coalition of trusted neighbors, cannot just remain a passive household. They must instantly become a micro-institution.
They have to rapidly assume every single responsibility that the state and the corporate supply chain used to handle.
This small group suddenly becomes the Department of Water and Power, the Department of Agriculture, the judicial system, the medical board, and the Department of Defense.
It is a total ground-up restructuring of human organization.
Yeah.
And the manual makes it very clear how drastically the incentives alter in this new structure.
Think about your life right now. We reinforce cooperation primarily through contracts, social trust, and laws.
If you hire a contractor and they steal your money, you don't go to their house with a weapon, you take them to civil court.
The state enforces the contract. Post-collapse, those external enforcement structures completely vanish.
So the incentives for cooperation reorganize purely around immediate physical survival and mutual defense. You aren't just sharing a mortgage and deciding who does the dishes anymore. Your household has become a tactical unit.
And within that newly formed tactical unit, the baseline requirements for every single member fundamentally change. In our current system, we have the luxury of allowing vast segments of the population to be non-combatants.
But the author emphasizes that in a decentralized survival scenario, everyone must be trained. Men, women, the able-bodied elderly, and even capable adolescents.
Pre-event societal norms regarding gender roles or age-appropriate responsibilities become completely irrelevant in the face of an existential threat.
The system no longer affords anyone the luxury of remaining a passive bystander. The book uses some very stark imagery to drive this point home. It explicitly states that sexism or outdated protective mentalities have no place post-collapse.
A mother might naturally take on the role of the inner circle protector, perhaps stationed in the safest, most fortified room of the house to guard the younger children.
But the author stresses that she cannot just hide and hope for the best. She must be heavily armed, proficient with her weapon, and psychologically prepared to fight, as the text puts it, like a lioness if the outer perimeter is breached.
Everyone is either a combatant or a critical support element, because the non-combatant status is a legal fiction provided by a state that no longer exists.
If we look at historical precedents for this kind of rapid systemic collapse and societal redesign, the author brings up a brilliant parallel, the era of Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons.
That historical connection really grounded the theory for me. Let's look at the systemic shift there. For centuries, the Romans had provided centralized law, order, and a professional standing army in Britain.
When the Roman Empire withdrew, they took that entire centralized system with them. Society effectively collapsed into localized vulnerabilities.
Then the Vikings began their raids. They were a highly mobile, decentralized threat.
Alfred the Great realized that a traditional, slow-moving centralized army couldn't catch them. So instead of just trying to fight them in open fields, he completely reorganized the social architecture.
He forced the agrarian population to build networks of fortified towns called burhs. It was a mathematical and systemic masterstroke, known as the Burgle Hittage.
Alfred didn't just build walls, he mandated a strict ratio. He calculated that every single pole, which was about 5.5 yards of town wall, had to be defended by one armed man from the surrounding farms.
He essentially rebuilt a decentralized martial tradition, forcing the family unit and the local agrarian community to become the primary mechanism of defense.
The Saxons survived the Viking incursions because they adapted their micro-institutions, the local extended families, into organized, fortified networks that could quickly assemble to project local force.
The survival manual we are analyzing is essentially advocating for a modern, localized version of that exact Saxon strategy. But to run a micro-institution effectively, whether it's a 9th century burg or a 21st century suburban home, you need a highly efficient leadership structure.
Which is where the text introduces the military concept of mission command. And this is where I see a lot of modern corporate-minded people struggling.
Oh, absolutely. In a normal household, you might have one parent who micromanages everything, the budget, the groceries, the schedule.
Or in a corporate environment, you have managers who oversee every single detail of a project.
But the author argues that in a high-stress survival scenario, micromanagement leads to catastrophic paralysis.
You cannot have one leader trying to personally ration the canned goods, schedule the night watch perimeter shifts, and inventory the medical supplies all at the exact same time.
Mission command, which actually has its roots in the 19th century Prussian military concept of Auftragstaktik, is the antidote to that paralysis.
It relies on the delegation of authority, not just the delegation of tasks.
You don't tell your group exactly how to do every little thing. Instead, you give an individual a specific area of responsibility, say, logistics or medical care.
You provide them with the overall mission intent. We need clean water for 6 people for the next 3 days. And then you step back and let them figure out the execution based on the reality on the ground.
One person owns logistics, another owns medical, another owns the security roster. It distributes the cognitive load and empowers individuals, turning a group of frightened, paralyzed civilians into a functional, resilient organization.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about decentralization and organizing these neat little micro-institutions. But let's introduce some friction here. Wouldn't a sudden power vacuum just lead to immediate warlordism?
That is a very valid concern.
When you successfully form these highly organized, heavily armed micro-institutions, what happens when they inevitably encounter other armed micro-institutions?
Right.
You now have multiple armed groups operating in the exact same resource-depleted environment with absolutely no central authority, no courts, and no police to mediate their disputes. It seems like a recipe for constant, endless violence.
That is the exact systemic vulnerability that game theory predicts in an anarchic environment. It is the classic security dilemma.
Group A arms themselves defensively. Group B sees Group A arming, assumes offensive intent, and arms themselves in response.
Both sides are acting rationally to protect themselves, but their actions escalate the overall tension until conflict becomes almost inevitable.
And that systemic reality leads us to the most surprising and frankly ironic part of this entire tactical manual. You are reading a book written by a special operations veteran. It has chapters on infantry tactics, squad battle drills, and complex ambushes.
Yet the absolute overriding cardinal principle repeated over and over again throughout the text is
Avoidance.
avoidance. Do
Yes,
everything in
yes.
your power not to use the tactics you just learned.
The brutal logic behind that principle is staggering once you strip away the Hollywood fantasy of the post-apocalyptic hero. Let's look at the medical math of the situation.
The medical math is terrifying.
In our current stable system, if you get into a physical altercation and sustain an injury, even a gunshot wound, the system catches you.
An ambulance arrives, you are taken to a sterile trauma center, surgeons operate, and you are given a massive course of broad-spectrum antibiotics.
In a collapsed system, that entire medical infrastructure is gone.
The fragility of life in a post-antibiotic environment completely changes the calculus of conflict. Without a reliable supply of intravenous antibiotics in sterile surgical environments, even a relatively minor peripheral wound, a gunshot to the arm or the leg, can easily become a death sentence due to sepsis and infection.
Therefore, the author argues, engaging in a fair fight is strategic suicide.
Even if you win a firefight against a rival group, if one of your family members takes a casualty, that is a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss.
The absolute safest outcome in a collapsed environment isn't dominating your enemy through superior firepower. It is preventing the conflict from ever materializing in the first place.
It is a masterclass in extreme risk management. The tactical maneuvers the book teaches, like the peel or bounding overwatch, aren't primarily designed for seeking out enemies to destroy.
They are designed for breaking contact. They are tools to help you escape an ambush and retreat to safety.
To achieve this constant state of avoidance, the author deeply explores the concept of profile. You have to consciously manage how your group appears to the outside world.
Profile management is essentially controlling the information asymmetry between you and potential threats. The manual divides this into maintaining a low profile versus a high profile.
Both have strategic applications depending on the environment.
Let's explore that balance. If you are staying in a suburban house, you generally want to maintain an extremely low profile. You employ blackout curtains so no light escapes at night.
You don't cook strong-smelling foods over an open fire during the day.
You might even deliberately make the exterior of the house look abandoned or previously looted, leaving trash on the lawn, breaking a non-essential window.
The goal is to blend into the misery of the environment, so you don't become a target for desperate people looking for hidden stockpiles.
Conversely, there are moments where a high-profile posture is the safer systemic choice. Imagine your group is forced to move through a contested area in a convoy of vehicles.
Trying to sneak 3 SUVs through a suburban grid is impossible.
In that scenario, the author suggests going high-profile. You display heavy weapons visibly, you wear armor, you maintain strict discipline spacing between vehicles.
You project overwhelming strength and hypervigilance. The goal here is deterrence.
You want a potential ambusher watching from a window to look at your convoy, calculate the risk-to-reward ratio, and decide to wait for an easier, softer target.
But isn't a high profile just inviting a challenge? If you were heavily armed and visible, doesn't a desperate group look at you and say, "They have weapons and gear, let's take it"?
It can, which is why profile management is a dynamic, constant calculation. A high profile deters opportunistic predators, the casually desperate. It might attract highly organized predatory gangs, which is why avoidance remains the primary rule.
And a crucial part of avoidance, beyond just how you look, is how you behave over time. The manual explicitly warns against ever setting routines.
Breaking routine. This goes against every instinct we have. Human beings are creatures of habit.
We naturally seek routine for comfort, especially in highly stressful, traumatic situations. We want predictability. We want to say, okay, every day at 10:00 a.m., John goes down to the creek to filter water.
But in an environment lacking institutional security, predictability is a fatal systemic vulnerability.
If John takes the exact same path to the creek at the exact same time every day, an opposing group, perhaps just a desperate family needing water, or a predatory gang, will observe that pattern.
They will map his route, note his timing, and use that predictability to set an ambush at the most advantageous choke point.
To survive, a micro-institution must adopt randomized patrolling and randomized logistics. You must use different routes, different times of day, and different personnel.
You must actively work against your own psychological desire for routine to prevent enemies from gathering actionable intelligence on your movements.
This constant need for avoidance, this terrifying, high-stakes game of cat and mouse just to procure water or firewood, inevitably forces every single group to confront the ultimate strategic dilemma of a systemic collapse.
It's the debate that apparently dominates all survivalist circles, the bug-in versus bug-out dilemma. When the world ends, do you stay in your home or do you pack your bags and flee?
From a systems analysis perspective, this is a phenomenal exercise in interpreting multivariable risk. There is no universally correct answer. It is entirely dependent on the specific physical, geographical, and social variables of your environment.
But we can analyze the systemic risks inherent in both options. Let's start with the risks of bugging in choosing to stay put in your primary residence.
The advantages of bugging in seem overwhelming at first glance, especially from a psychological standpoint. You know the terrain of your own neighborhood perfectly.
You already have all your supplies, your food, and your water filtration systems stored right there. You completely avoid the chaotic, unpredictable dangers of the open road.
And crucially, you have the comfort of familiar surroundings. If you have young children or elderly family members, ripping them away from their home and throwing them into a vehicle is profoundly traumatic. Staying put feels safer.
It feels safer, but the manual is quick to point out that the physical realities of modern architecture tell a different story. The systemic risks of staying in a typical suburban or urban home are massive.
Modern suburbia is built for economic efficiency and aesthetics, not defense. Architecturally, it is incredibly weak.
The author points out a terrifying ballistic reality. Standard 5.56 high-velocity rifle rounds will punch straight through the vinyl siding, the exterior plywood, the fiberglass insulation, and the interior drywall of a standard American house.
And they will keep going through the interior walls. You cannot effectively defend a modern home from the inside without being deeply exposed to penetrating fire.
Your walls offer visual concealment, but absolutely zero ballistic cover.
And beyond the architectural weakness, there's the geographic reality. Cities and dense suburbs are entirely dependent on that just-in-time supply chain we discussed earlier.
The moment the trucks stop, those areas instantly become resource deserts. Within weeks, the massive population density turns the environment into a high-threat zone of desperate, starving people.
If you are the only house in a 5-block radius with the smell of cooking food, you are a target.
And if a larger, desperate group wants what you have, and they realize they can't easily breach your front door because you are armed, the manual warns they will simply bypass your security by using fire.
They will throw a Molotov cocktail onto your roof and burn you out. It is a terrifying, brutal calculus.
So understanding those vulnerabilities, a rational actor might think, okay, staying in the suburbs is a death trap. I will evacuate. I will bug out to a remote cabin in the woods or a rural farming community.
But bugging out introduces an entirely different and arguably more volatile set of systemic vulnerabilities. The moment you lock your front door and step into your vehicle, you are abandoning your fortified position and exposing yourself to the massive unknown.
And the most significant risk in that scenario is the transportation infrastructure itself. This is where the manual uses a deeply evocative historical term. It describes the mass of unprepared, panicked people simultaneously fleeing the urban centers as the Golden Horde.
Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine you are in your home right now. A massive grid failure occurs. 3 days go by. The supermarkets are empty. Panic sets in. Millions of people all make the exact same decision at the exact same time. We need to leave the city.
They all pack their cars and head for the obvious major highways. What actually happens?
Total systemic gridlock. Highway infrastructure is designed to handle a specific volume of staggered commuter traffic, not the simultaneous evacuation of an entire metropolitan population.
We have seen micro-examples of this during hurricane evacuations, like Hurricane Rita in Houston, where the highways became multi-day parking lots.
But in a collapse scenario, it's worse. When those cars sit in gridlock for hours, engines idling, they're...
The author describes these spontaneous, desperate choke points of civil disorder forming on the interstates, surrounded by thousands of broken-down, out-of-gas vehicles.
If you are caught in that gridlock and your SUV runs out of fuel on Interstate 95, your situation changes instantaneously. You are no longer a tactical survivalist executing a planned relocation.
You are suddenly a homeless refugee on foot, carrying only what fits in a backpack, surrounded by thousands of other desperate, angry competitors in a highly hostile, resource-depleted environment.
This is exactly why the author stresses that you should almost never evacuate unless you have two very specific things already established: a secure, stocked, and defensible bug-out location, a BOL waiting for you, and a thoroughly reconnoitered back road route to get there that avoids all major choke points.
Fleeing into the national forest with a tent, a hunting rifle, and a romanticized fantasy of living off the land is a delusion that ends poorly when 50,000 other desperate people have the exact same idea in the same woods.
By bugging out without a concrete destination, you are essentially trading the known, manageable risks of your home for the chaotic, uncontrollable, and highly lethal risks of a moving mob.
So let's assume you make the agonizing choice.
When we talk about defense in this context, we are not just talking about shooting a gun. We are talking about creating physical, spatial systems that attempt to replace the deterrence and security normally provided by law enforcement.
The manual breaks down several tactical principles of defense, and three of them stand out as critical systems-level concepts: 360-degree security, depth, and mutual support.
Let's walk through those mechanics because they are fascinating to visualize. First, 360-degree security. The author quotes an old military adage: "He who defends everywhere defends nowhere."
You can't have a rifle pointed out of every single window at all times. You don't have the manpower, but you still must have all-around observation.
You can't just reinforce the front door, lock the deadbolt, and stare out the living room window toward the street. If your defensive focus only points in one direction, an intelligent attacker will simply walk through the neighbor's yard, approach from the rear, and flank you.
You need observation posts, early warning sensors, or trip flares that cover every possible avenue of approach to your property.
The second principle is depth. In a systemic sense, depth is about creating spatial and temporal buffers. You want your defense to absorb an attack like a sponge, rather than shattering like a brittle eggshell.
If the only physical barrier between your family and an armed attacker is the deadbolt on your front door, your system has zero depth.
If that deadbolt is kicked in, the attacker is instantly inside your perimeter, and you are fighting a chaotic gun battle in your living room, putting non-combatants at extreme risk.
To counter that, the manual stresses creating standoff distance. You want to push your perimeter out as far as possible.
You want to identify and engage threats at the property line or down the driveway long before they can physically touch your primary structure.
If they're kept 50 yards away, they can't throw that Molotov cocktail through your window. Depth buys you time, and time gives you the ability to make cognitive decisions rather than just reacting with panic.
And the third crucial principle is mutual support, which is essentially the concept of system redundancy applied to a gunfight. If you establish two defensive positions, say you have two people guarding the perimeter of your property, their fields of observation and fire must interlock.
Let's visualize that. Think of it like two spotlights illuminating a dark yard. If you only have one spotlight covering the front gate, and that bulb burns out, or in a tactical scenario, if that guard's weapon jams or they're pinned down by incoming fire, you are left in pitch black.
That area is completely vulnerable.
But if you position two spotlights at different angles so their beams cross and overlap in the middle, you have redundancy. Even if one light goes out, the most critical area is still illuminated by the second light.
Exactly. Translated to defense, that means if one position is overwhelmed or suppressed by an attacker, the second position can shoot into the space directly in front of the first position to protect it. They support each other.
It is an interconnected, resilient, defensive network. You are essentially replacing the modern 911 dispatch system and police response times with a localized physical geometry of overlapping rifle fire.
It is a profoundly bleak reality to contemplate, but structurally, it makes perfect sense. But here is where the manual introduces a concept that I found to be the most intellectually challenging part of the entire book.
Up until now, we've been talking about this scenario as a binary switch. The world is either perfectly stable and civilized, or the switch flips and it's suddenly a Mad Max wasteland.
But the author spends a significant amount of time talking about the transition period, the slide into collapse, the gray areas.
And from a systems perspective, the slide is perhaps the most dangerous and volatile phase of a systemic breakdown. Complex systems rarely fail instantaneously, they degrade over time.
During this degradation phase, you have a massive, deadly information asymmetry. Different actors in the same environment are operating under completely different assumptions about what the rules of reality currently are.
The author gives this incredibly tense, hypothetical scenario that perfectly illustrates this gray area. Imagine you've decided the situation in the city is untenable. The power has been out for a week, there are riots, and the police force is severely depleted.
You pack your family into an SUV, you are heavily armed to protect yourselves from looters, and you are taking back roads out of the county, heading for your rural bug-out location.
Suddenly, in your rearview mirror, you see flashing red and blue lights. You are being pulled over by a zealous local sheriff's deputy.
In our normal, stable system, the social contract dictates exactly how you behave. You pull over, put your hands on the wheel, and submit to the officer's authority because the overarching institutions of justice, the courts, the internal affairs departments, the civil rights laws guarantee your relative safety and your legal rights.
But in this slide phase, those institutions are actively failing. Does this specific deputy realize the system is collapsing around him? Is he a good cop trying to maintain order in his jurisdiction?
Or is he operating in complete denial, rigidly enforcing pre-event laws in a world where those laws no longer offer protection? Or worse, has he already realized the collapse has occurred and is using his badge to confiscate supplies?
That is the impossible tension. The deputy walks up to your SUV, shines a flashlight inside, sees the rifles and the tactical gear, and decides you look like a dangerous threat. He orders you to step out of the vehicle, surrender your weapons, and he intends to take you into custody.
Now you, as the head of your micro-institution, face an impossible, agonizing choice. Do you submit to the pre-event laws, hand over your only means of defense, and risk your family being left entirely unarmed, vulnerable, and separated in a zone that is rapidly descending into total lawlessness?
Or do you resist the officer, which, under normal circumstances, makes you a violent convicted felon, but in a collapse scenario might be the absolute only way to keep your family alive?
That specific hypothetical perfectly captures the ultimate crisis in perception that we try to explore on this show. We walk around every single day, implicitly assuming that security, the rule of law, and social order are permanent, physical features of the natural world.
We treat them like gravity or mountains or the weather.
But they aren't. They are fragile, invisible, entirely synthetic architectures. And they are sustained by absolutely nothing other than collective belief.
It really is the Tinkerbell effect applied to human civilization. The entire system, the money in your bank account, the authority of the police officer's badge, the safety of your front door, only works because we all collectively clap our hands, agree to the social contract, and believe in it.
Precisely. The moment that collective expectation vanishes, whether due to a massive power grid failure, a localized natural disaster, or a cascading economic collapse, that invisible architecture evaporates.
And when the architecture evaporates, human behavior changes instantaneously. The rules of physics remain exactly the same, but the rules of societal reality completely invert.
Seen through this analytical lens, the tactical manual we are discussing today isn't truly just about how to clear a room or how to calculate the trajectory of a rifle round. It functions as a mirror.
It reflects how deeply, profoundly dependent we are on centralized institutional frameworks that we take completely for granted right up until the very second they fail.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought to leave you with today. This specific idea isn't explicitly spelled out in the tactical manual, but is the inevitable logical conclusion of every single system we've just discussed.
The author notes that if you manage to survive the initial chaos of the collapse, and you endure the mass die-offs from starvation and lack of medicine, eventually the remaining survivors cannot stay isolated forever.
They have to form larger communities to farm, to establish localized economies, and to rebuild, because a single extended family cannot sustain a micro-institution indefinitely.
You eventually need large-scale agriculture. You need a complex division of labor to produce medicine and manufactured goods. You fundamentally need society to return.
All right, so follow the logic. You survive the collapse, you build a highly organized, heavily armed community.
Right.
You establish strict rules for defense, you delegate authority through mission command, you create judicial systems that deal with outsiders and internal disputes.
At what point does your successful, highly structured survivor community simply recreate the exact same centralized government, the exact same monopoly on force, and the exact same authority structures that you just spent all this blood and effort surviving the loss of?
Are we, as a species, just doomed to reboot the exact same operating system over and over again, scaling up from the family unit to the tribe, to the walled city, to the nation-state, only to watch the system become brittle, collapse under its own weight, and force us to start all over?
It is something for you to deeply mull over the next time you are standing in the sterile, perfectly stocked aisle of your local supermarket, entirely dependent on the invisible systems humming around you. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.